Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Stefano Feltri. I work as a communication advisor for the Institute for European Policymaking, which is a think tank hosted by Bocconi University that is focused on creating a bridge between academic research and the policy debate. It was founded by Mario Monti a couple of years ago, and now the president is Catherine De Vries, the director is Daniel Gross. As almost all the think tank in Europe, we started to move from the traditional topic for a Bocconi think tank and Bocconi approach, which are financial markets, trade, and innovation to start to discuss defense and geopolitical issues. With this goal, we started a series of webinars with the people who are real experts in this field, and not only from academia and think tanks. The Institute has decided to create a long-term relationship with some journalists who are relevant in the policy discussion at European level. So we have now some media fellows who are journalists connected with the Institute. So let me introduce the two guests of today's discussion. We have Monica Perosino. She's a journalist for the Italian daily La Stampa. And she's a real expert of the topic we're going to discuss, which is the war, Ukraine, and the acceleration of history. Because Monica, she has been traveling all around the most relevant countries in this moment, Ukraine, Georgia, and all the eastern flank. Actually, she has just came back tonight from Ukraine. So she has many interesting ideas to share with us. And then we have Thomas Gomart. Thomas Gomart is the director of IFRI, Institut Français de Relations Internationales, which is the most respected think tank in France in the geopolitical and international relations realm. Thomas Gomart is also a friend of IEP. He participated to our annual event in Milan last October. And he's the author of a very important book called L'accélération de l'histoire, the acceleration of history, which offers a very useful framework to discuss the recent events that I don't have to tell you that they are developing so fast that even for us journalists, it's almost impossible to remain connected with the last developments. And this represents a real challenge for academics and scholars who are more used to long-term projects. Okay, so we want to discuss how the EU can and is reacting to this new framework, the crisis of transatlantic relations, the necessity of improving European defense, and all the other topics connected to the recent geopolitical turmoil. But I would like to start with real people and on-field reporting with Monica. So where were you based in Ukraine? What was your impression and what were the differences between this trip and your previous reporting trip in the region?
Hello, good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me here today. And I apologize because if I say something confused, it's just because I had like 4 hours of sleep and a long journey back. But thank you anyway, and thank you for all these questions because are many of them, Stefano. And as you anticipated, I was in Ukraine for the last 2 weeks, and I think there was I think definitely in the last 3 years of the war, one of the most important moment of all the war, because the last 2 weeks have, with no doubts, been destabilizing and surprising for many perspectives. And if I can just add just note, outside the field, the battlefield, we had also the Romanian case that has been a mainly discussed problem, even in Ukraine. So I was based in the eastern part of Ukraine, just from Kherson, which is in the south, and then close to Pokrovsk, not so close to Pokrovsk, because of course we couldn't stay there, but we witnessed very fast change, because on the front lines, when America, historical ally to Kiev, the United States, turned its back on Ukraine the last 28th of February. So for the first time, I saw the political and military world began to operate on the same temporal plane, resulting in a sudden acceleration of events on the ground. So I guess, it's my opinion, of course, but it's not only my opinion, that Russia, after 28th of February, had the chance, the opportunity to escalate on the ground, and of course it took this opportunity. So the main problem was that Russia thought that Ukraine was alone in the battle, with no allies anymore, and it took some days to for Ukrainian as well to say, okay, maybe now we have European Union from our side, and then now they are very confident about this option, because Trump is considered to be the second enemy on the battlefield now. He's not an ally anymore. He's not a neutral actor on the field and in the world, but he's an enemy, especially after the decision and the menaces to cut down aids, military aids, of course, but especially intelligence aids. And we saw an escalation on the battlefield and on the first line town, because we have to remember that the line of the combats, the active combats, is surrounded by civilians and towns and people still living there. We more or less counted at least 2 million people living on the very long front line. And another thing is that the atmosphere there, of course, soldiers and civilians are exhausted after 3 years, and especially soldier on the front line of Pokrovsk, and some indirect witness from Kursk Oblast as well, was willing to have a ceasefire, but not a ceasefire as a freezing conflict, a ceasefire just to recover for the huge losses. After this 28th of February, this ambush on Zelensky, they said, okay, we will keep the position anyway. We have to, because we are unprotected from our ally, from our main ally. So there is a composite situation on the front line. And after, I think, 2 years, I've witnessed a great escape again, a great flow of people leaving the eastern part of Ukraine again, because of these drones attack, every night drones attack, and ballistic missile. I was in one of the Dobropilya, I don't know if you heard about it. It was a strike with 2 ballistic missiles and I think 4 or 5 drones, kamikaze drones. It is in the eastern flank of eastern part of Ukraine, with 14 dead people. It was a strike, just a residential area, so it just aim at terrify civilians. And so what we saw on one side, a determination to keep on fighting on the Ukrainian side, and even on the civilian side, they still are very they're tired, but is still very conscious of the perils that will be being under Russian occupation. And on the other side, this switch in the political world, in the political outside of Ukraine, which led Ukrainians to think that they are more alone than ever, and they have to rely on Europe. on the other side, Ukraine, and especially military on the front line, they are confident that this switch in the political assessment, in the political situation, will lead to a more conscious Europe with its defense. So they're quite optimistic about that. And a third problem we have been telling about and we have been witnessing about is the problem of occupied territories, because one main point of frustration in Ukraine is that they call the big boss of the world. So Putin and Trump and Vance as well is not very well
Very popular.
known in Ukraine now. They're discussing about sharing territories without thinking that a big part of Ukrainian people are still under occupation, and they feel abandoned by international community. Nobody's is talking about them. They're talking about, for example, rare earth deals or business deals and ceasefire. But a ceasefire now means that all the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk occupied territories will be freezed under occupation. And this is the main threat that Ukrainians are facing now, especially because families are very often divided by a line. So one person one daughter is living on the occupied territories and the mother is living in the free Ukraine. So there is a humanitarian problem with occupied territories.
Just a quick clarification. When you were discussing about drones attack and ballistic missiles that hit civilians and so on, do you mean that these attacks were possible because the US switched off their access to satellite support and to intelligence information after the Oval Office clash between the Trump administration and Zelensky, correct?
Definitely is not my opinion, of course, is a frontline military opinion that they were very angry about this, because in the 24 hours after this switching off of Maxar, also satellite maps and capability for the air defense of Ukraine to see the missiles arrived, strikes were very much more effective. Russian strikes were very much more effective than before, and so they put the blame on these being blinded by USA.
Okay, thank you, thank you. That's super interesting. Thomas, I forgot to mention that you are also a Russian expert, and this I would like to start with leveraging this expertise of yours. If you can help us to understand how do you think that Russia and Putin are looking at the recent developments in the West and the crisis of transatlantic relations, because as Monica was saying, Russia was extremely quick in profiting from the situation and the tensions between Zelensky and the Trump administration. What do you expect from Russia in this new framework? And also, if you can explain a very interesting idea that you comment on in your book, that basically Putin always need a war, he always need an enemy, and for him, war is not, how to say, a point in time, but is a way of approaching politics and a way of consolidating his power.
Thank you, Stefano, for your invitation. I'm very happy to have this discussion with Monica and you. Regarding, the current situation from a Russian perspective, I would say that it's completely unexpected. I mean, President Trump is delivering a strategic gift to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin was in a deadlock military situation in Ukraine, was successful in transforming this difficult military situation into a sort of new diplomatic positioning regarding, in particular, global south. But to have the US president explaining that now the responsible for the war is Ukraine is just a strategic gift with absolute and dramatic consequences for Ukraine, as it was reminded by Monica. So, in my opinion, the objective of the Kremlin remains the same. First of all, it is to continue so-called denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, and of course to try to put away President Zelensky, who is now attacked on his political legitimacy by the Kremlin, which is a paradox, but which is also a paradox made possible because of the attitude of the US administration. So it's to destroy Ukraine and to subvert Ukraine first. Second objective, it is to very long-standing objective of the Soviets and Russian diplomacy, which is to destroy the transatlantic link. And to some extent, we are closer to this situation than only 1 month ago. And I think the third objectives, given this impression that many things are now in flux and possible, it's to propose a new European order disorder to be back to 1997 as it was expressed by the memorandum of December 2021. So it is, in my opinion, what is the remnant objectives of the Kremlin. I would add another thing. The problem in Europe when we are dealing with this war and with Russia. This war, in my opinion, started already 11 years ago by the annexation of Crimea. Of course, the aggression of February 2022 is a turning point because it was a large-scale invasion. And what was not expected by the Kremlin, it is that this so-called special military operation stayed for more than 3 years and has been transformed into an attrition war. But I think that we should understand that in the Soviet/Russian strategic culture, there is all the time warfare and diplomacy. Whereas in our perspective, in European perspective, that's a different sequence. We do think that there is time for war and time for diplomacy. We make a clear distinction between period of peace, period of time. It is not the Russian perspective. And I do think that, unfortunately, the Kremlin will continue to have the same way of negotiating, which is a way not to negotiate in the current context, except with the US, because it is a way to say we are now once again a superpower. We can blame Ukraine very easily, and we can also put away Europeans. But the tradition of negotiation by the Soviet diplomacy, it is 3 points, 3 things. Maximize your objective, use ultimatums, and never give something because on the other side they are so happy and so eager to negotiate that they will make some concession.
And how do you apply this framework in the current negotiation, this ceasefire negotiation that apparently has started in Riyadh?
So we will see, because it was discussed between Ukraine and the US. So now it is the job of US diplomacy to present it to Russia. There are different options. The ceasefire, can start, but you had also a ceasefire in 2014, and Russia was able to wait for 8 years to come back by a large-scale invasion. So my point is just to say that, of course, we all want a peace solution, but I think that we should make very clear distinction between what could be a temporary truce, what could be a ceasefire, what sort of duration, what could be after that an agreement, what could be a new discussion on the security of Ukraine, what would be a discussion on the European security architecture. I think there is already, 5 completely different things. And the problem we are facing it is that now the proposal made by the White House is peace against war, as if it can be possible to have a peace day one. Unfortunately, I don't think so. And Monica reminds us what is the Ukrainian mindset, currently. So my point is just to say that we will see first the Kremlin's reaction to what was discussed in Riyadh between Ukrainians and Americans. And second, a ceasefire can be decided. Its implementation is another thing. And to move from a ceasefire to an agreement, in my opinion, will require more than 24 hours, as it was expected by President Trump.
Thank you, Thomas. And we are discussing mainly Ukraine, but as Monica reminded us before, this is a regional crisis and also a transatlantic crisis, obviously. But Monica, can you help us to understand how this crisis is moving from Ukraine to all the region? You have covered extensively Georgia, for example, and you mentioned before Romania, where I don't know if everybody is familiar with that story, but basically the pro-Russian candidate has been ousted from the competition after the Constitutional Court basically canceled the presidential election in December, and this led to the resigning of the president. It's a major institutional crisis. And apparently, is this all related to what is happening in Ukraine? So, to put it in another way, is Russia already at war with many countries in Europe and not only with Ukraine?
Just a very short premise. When I start covering Eastern flank, that means Baltics, Poland, Hungary, and all these Central Europe and Eastern Europe countries. When I first go to Poland, like 15 years ago, I found something very peculiar in the Polish way of looking at Russia. And I thought at that time, I was very naive and very Italian in this way. Oh, they are Russia obsessed. They are too frightened by something that it doesn't exist. And the same thing I could say about Baltics. They were talking about these continuous provocation by the borders, spying and small sabotage. So at that time, 50 years ago, I think that there was Russophobic in a way, maybe because of the past. Of course, they had a very bad experience under Soviet occupation. But then I realized that it's not a recent war that Russian is managing to do in Europe. They're very good at manipulating and controlling these sort of self-determination of people. And we saw in the last year just an escalation of that. Maybe we are more aware as well as Southern Europeans than before. And Russian feels maybe is more powerful in this contest, or it needs more imperialistic politics to feel more powerful itself. So yes, it's very frightening. I think that this hybrid war against Europe and against Georgia, for example, is not a recent thing, but it's a long-standing thing we have. And in the last year, connected with Ukraine is just increased. And we saw, I was in Georgia, as you mentioned, Stefano, and it was a very impressive experience. I've never been there before. Now we have celebrated, if we can say so, 100 days of non-stop protesting in the squares, because Georgia, even if geographically far from the heart of Europe, feels very pro-European and against Russia for, of course, again, historical reason in a way. But the thing that frightened me much was this inference in Romania, as you summarized just a few minutes ago. On December 26, I guess, Romania's constitutional court blocked the result of the presidential election, which is a very strong position. And of course, all the pro-Russian propaganda and some other people would call it the killing of democracy, because you don't stop the result, you don't cancel the result of an election. But the evidence of the inquiries that was taken by the tribunal is that there was a big, huge Russian interference in this election, with very modern, very vast scale aggression, with TikTok socials, a lot of money put in manipulating people. So this is really frightening. I don't know why, but I'm more frightened by this kind of hybrid war than the real war that is battling in Ukraine, because it's more under the radar. So we'll see what's happening next in Romania. But yes, I think there is a scheme in Europe taken by Russia to divide, to create conspiracy theory to weaken the unity of Europe.
Okay. Yeah, I agree that it's quite frightening what's going on, and Romania is a dangerous precedent. No matter which side you take, it's a relevant event for all of us. Thomas, in your book, you discuss as many forces that have accelerated history. You mentioned climate crisis, artificial intelligence, the new rebalancing of power between the G7 countries, the global south, and democracy and autocracy. Now the EU has finally reacted. We have been starting to discuss this plan, Rearm EU. Do you think that there is a clear strategy behind this apparently strong reaction by the EU? Do you think that the EU has prioritized in a way what it's trying to do? So security is more important than the Green Deal, and more important than competitiveness, or we are trying to pursue different goals at the same time, with the risk that we do not reach, that we underperform in all these fields. How do you see this new security security priority compare with other priorities?
Before responding directly to your question, allow me to add maybe two personal experience, because yesterday, and Monica mentioned the situation in Romania, in Georgia, and I think we should also add Moldova, which is in a very, very uncomfortable situation. And yesterday morning, we received at IFRI President Sanlu, and it's a very, very uncomfortable situation, especially if there is, a sort of difference of political regime between Romania and Moldova in the coming month. The second personal experience, also yesterday, by the way, is a way to respond to your question, Stefano, because I was asked by General Burkhardt, the French Chief of Staff, to present a research in front of the 34 Chief of Staff, Chief of Defense, which were gathered in Paris yesterday. They met with President Macron, and this meeting was co-chaired by France and the UK. So it's a way for me to respond to your question. In terms of security, the thing is that the EU is not the proper body. The attempts to try to have a European position is much more based on what is sometimes called coalition of the willings, and in the current circumstances, clearly with the Franco-British leadership. So that's point number one. Point number two, it is to say that the real clash, intellectual, political, strategic clash right now within Europe is in particular in Germany more than elsewhere. You know, for my country, the US position is not welcome, of course, but it's not really a surprise. Our strategic culture is based since now, let's say 60 decades on this idea that one day maybe the US will leave from the European continent. And we understood because of our history that never the US will play their vital interest for Europeans. So it's not really a surprise. It's not something welcome once again, you know, in Paris, but it's not really a surprise. For Germany, it's completely different because Germany was shocked by G.D. Vance's speech in Munich, not only by the speech, but also by the fact that the US vice president preferred to meet with the AfD leader than with the chancellor. And also, you know, visited Dachau. So it's a real shock for Germany, and future Chancellor Merz made very, very important statements, you know, in the last few days, which, in my opinion, illustrates, you know, this shock. So now we have, you know, and it was part of the discussion yesterday, because this notion of coalition of the willings is very uncomfortable for many European countries, which are intellectually first and also physically, in a sense, not capable to think without the US support. And I think that's the most important and fundamental issue. Should we let Ukraine alone if the US continues the way which was described? The political answer right now, you know, in France is no. Even if, you know, this morning I testimonied in front of our parliaments, and you see that it's really a debate. But for the presidents, it is very clear that what is happening in Ukraine is essential for European security now. And that's why there is a sense of, you know, questions, you know, in Paris regarding the attitude of other Europeans. Of course, a US backstop would be very welcome if we think in terms of providing security guarantees, but we should be confident enough in ourselves to envisage different options, US backstops, but no US backstops also. And what does it mean for Europeans in these circumstances?
Okay, yeah, that's very important question. We are going to publish tomorrow a paper by our director, Daniel Gross, who tackles exactly one of these aspects. How can Europe support, military support Ukraine without the US? And his proposal is basically to create a fund which mirrors the maybe not everybody remembers the European Financial Stability Fund, which was the first version of the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. So it's quite technical, but it's very, very important to have this kind of discussion. And speaking of which, now I open the floor to Q&A. So I invite you to use the Q&A box or to raise your hand so we can give you the floor. I start with a question that we have just received by Alberto Pradella, who advanced one of the arguments that we have heard many times, especially in Italy, especially in TV shows and on some newspaper. Why nobody talks about the real cause of this war that is in relation with the Minsk agreement that in 2014 had required Ukraine the obligation to organize a referendum in Donbas to see how many pro-Russian wanted to stay with Russia instead Ukraine, and Ukraine never wanted to organize it. How is it possible to spend a million of euro helping, I would say billion of euro, helping to fight a war that could have been avoided easily? This is a variation on the argument saying that basically, ultimately, it's Ukraine's fault, the war. How do you respond? Who wants, maybe Monica, you want to take this one since you spent many times with the Ukrainians recently?
I will be very, very short, because if these people asking this question should just take a minute to think how it can be possible to organize a referendum or a popular question during the wartime. We are witnessing all the Russian call it passportization process in the occupied territories, and they had actually a sort of election in the Donetsk and Lugansk, and we saw this military soldiers, I think, but from the Electoral Russian Commission, going house by house with the rifle on their back, actually asking babushkas and civilians, so do you want to stay with Russia or with Ukraine? So I think that to answer this question and to ask this question at the same time, people should imagine what is it to live in a war zone, in a war environment. You can't think about elections now, even now, and a lot of discussion were made about Zelensky not legitimate mandate because it's expired. Of course, it's how can it be to organize election during war?
Which is quite also an argument now, speaking about general election in Ukraine, because this is one of the when President Trump called Zelensky a dictator because he was not hosting election in a country at war. But Thomas, maybe you can answer from a different perspective, because in your book you explain quite extensively what is the relevance of Ukrainian independence and how it is connected basically with the security guarantees and nuclear power. And I mean, in another way, when things started to get wrong, to get problematic for Russia, it was possible to prevent this war, finding an agreement that basically gave Russia something to find a compromise without having the full-scale invasion, or not.
Well, three things. Just maybe starting by reminding to Alberto Pradella that there was the Minsk, there were the Minsk agreements because there were, Russian little green men on the Ukrainian soil. So I think it's important to start by reminding that there was annexation of Crimea, destabilization of Donbass, and after that, to avoid escalation, this diplomatic initiative taken by Berlin and Paris in touch with Minsk, of course, and Moscow, because there was initially a Russian aggression. So that's my very first point. My second point now about the consequences of this war. Yes, there is all this debate that this war should have been avoided. I would say like many wars, you know, and there are now a lot of literature on that. There is this debate about NATO and EU enlargements. I think that Mary Sarratt in her book explain, you know, and describe all this myth about NATO enlargement and how it was understood or misunderstood by Moscow. It's a way maybe also to remind that there was different turning points in the Russian foreign policy. I don't say that there was no mistakes on the European side, certainly not. I think that one of the big mistakes was precisely, you know, the EU enlargement, which was already presented as a sort of technocratic evolution, whereas it was read for obvious reasons in pure geopolitical terms in Moscow. But to be back to the different turning point, one of them was 2007, President Putin's speech in Munich. And it was clear that there was a denunciation of the US exceptionalism. There was this idea of Western arrogance. That's one thing. After that, there was, of course, the war in Georgia in 2008. There was this very important years between 2008 and 2012 because President Putin was, if you remember, president of the government, and Dmitry Medvedev was in charge. And during that time, there was the military intervention in Libya led by France, the UK, supported by the US, which was a disaster in terms of consequences. And it was seen by the Russian as a new example of Western interventionism. And that leads to Syria. And the fact that the decision not to intervene in Syria create a strategic vacuum in 2013, which was filled by Russia. And also, what is very important to understand, it is, I think, this external pressure, this strategic environment, plus, and the plus is maybe the most important thing, the evolution of the Russian regime itself. I mean, when President Putin came back in 2012, there was the repression of the so-called Bolotnaya demonstration, plus the change of constitution to become president for life. And to some extent, the choice was made by Russia. I mean, between 2000 and 2008, the main partner was Germany and Europe. And when Putin was back in the Kremlin in 2012, the main partner has become China, because also there was the reading made by the Russian authority of the 2008 financial crisis, and the fact that Russian banks were not refunded like other European banks by American banks in dollar. Mm-hmm. So all of that explains many things, but I insist on, of course, the mistakes made, but more importantly, the decision taken by President Putin to go for annexation of Crimea and destabilization of Donbass in 2014. And after that, the consequences of his decision.
Thank you, Thomas. That's super interesting. We have many other questions, so maybe Monica can take this one because I think it's a question that all the Ukrainians raise. How is it possible to believe even a single word of what the Russians say or will say in future talks, given their history of continuous deception? And then we have a question for Thomas. You mentioned the ultimatum of December 2021 when Russia demanded to come back to the situation ante-1997, which is probably the final goal of Russia's vision of Europe. Do you think that the United States under Trump can even begin to negotiate on this request? And then we have a final question. After the clash by Massimiliano Boni, after the clash in the Oval Office in Italy, we read it, according to some opinion makers, that the peace was very near in Ankara 2 years ago, after a few months from the beginning of war, during the talks between Ukraine and that Russia, but Mr. Biden and Mr. Johnson were against this agreement. What is your opinion about this scenario? Here, just a quick clarification for all the others. There is this long piece on foreign affairs that has basically told all this secret history of these negotiations in Ankara in the spring 2022. And in my opinion, this piece was never fully read by Italian commentators who pretend that we were so close to end the war after it was started that for whatever reason we decided to keep on fighting because the UK and US wanted the war. So it's interesting to hear you both on this point. But Monica, let's start with what Ukrainians think about how trustworthy are the Russians.
Well, there is a simple answer. They don't trust him at all. They suggest that any proposal of a truce or a ceasefire or any words actually coming from Russia won't be effective. So they don't trust any kind of real ability on Russian behavior and talking and proposal. And if I can mention also the Ankara talks, we have to remember that during that talks there was Bucha massacre. So while they were talking about a possibility of ceasefire, I'm not so sure that was Johnson and France that didn't want to close the negotiation, but still Russia was doing something that all the world will be you know, a kind of symbol of this invasion. So actually Ukrainian are shadows and lies. They want a ceasefire, but they don't want a ceasefire proposed by Russia only without any security agreement, because they don't trust him. If I can mention an episode, for a couple of almost 2 days, the owner of Monobank, which is a bank from Ukraine, has raised a subscription to bring back nuclears, which Ukraine was dismantling as an agreement to defend themselves against Russia. And in 24 hours, they raised almost 1 million euros to have nuclear power to defend themselves, because they don't trust any kind of talking with Russian without a third party that can guarantee the security in Ukraine.
Thank you, very clear. Thomas, the pre-1997 situation and the Ankara negotiation, what do you think?
I think, you know, everything is possible in the current context coming from the White House. When you have the US president explaining, you know, that this war was created by Ukraine, this reverse approach makes, in my opinion, everything possible. And I think we are now in a very uncomfortable situation for Europeans, because there is an ideological collusion between the Kremlin and the White House. And this ideological collusion is rooted first on this notion of sphere of influence. So the question is, for Europeans, what would be our reaction if, for the celebration of the 9th of May on the Red Square, President Trump, who do want to receive the Nobel Prizes, will appear with President Putin and President Xi? Second,
Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's something that, I mean, it's among the
it will be the
can
logic. It will be the logic of sphere of influence, and the fact that you have now this idea in DC that at the global level there is the US, China, and Russia. Europeans are just here to watch at them to some extent. So first, sphere of influence. Second, president for life. The idea that strong men, they are so strong that they can deal by themselves everything, sort of a cult of personality, which is very widespread in the US now with Trump and also with President Putin in Russia. And I would add something else which is very important to me, which is global affairism. To some extent, the wealthiest man in the world, Elon Musk, can be compared to one of the wealthiest men in the world, which is President Putin. And you have this idea that money can do everything, like new exploitation in the Arctic regions, or complete deregulation. And I think that this ideological collusion is the most important thing since the last 7 weeks with the new Trump's term. Now, the memo. So in these circumstances, I don't exclude the possibility of having this sort of deal, because for Trump, I think it would be humiliated now to stay in Ukraine. And I think also that it seems to us very strange, but there is this idea that Europeans should manage by themselves, and that NATO is maybe no so important than Europeans thought it was for the US. Now, the question of the agreement 2022 with the paper by Sam Sharap and S.I. Radchenko. Yes, I in line with Monica and Bucha, and also the this event is very often used, like it was said that the Minsk agreement was not implemented because of Ukraine attitude. It's the same narrative, I would say, to try to some extent to try to blame Ukraine for having resisted. Mm-hmm. That's basically the point. In fact, Ukraine is blamed for having resisted by some people. By the way, I strongly recommend the book by Sergei Rachko, To Run the World, which is a very detailed and brilliant analysis of Soviet security policy from 1945 to 1991. And the basic idea is, in fact, that the Soviets all the time search the proper balance between security and guarantees. Slip of the mind. Between security and legitimacy. Why? Because what was very important for the Soviet diplomacy, it was that the border created in Yalta, and so the advance made by the Red Army, was seen as legitimate by Westerners, and they tried to establish security arrangement and agreements with European countries. And this process, to some extent, led to the Helsinki Conference in 1975, which was the acceptation by everyone of the borders coming from Yalta. Now we are in a reverse situation, because to some extent, the Russian diplomacy tries to have this legitimacy of the new border in Ukraine, not with European countries, but with the US directly.
That's super interesting. A very final question from, I assume it's Professor Andrea Colli who connected, and then he reconnected from a different account, saying that he asked if there is a strategy by the US administration to use Russia as a shoulder to balance the geopolitical struggle from westwards, skipping totally Europe. If I understand correctly, as the reverse Nixon argument, saying that the true goal of the Trump administration is to split Russia and China, so that he's using Russia for, how to say, traditional Western diplomacy goals rather than sidelining with dictators. What do you think, Thomas? And then we get close to the end.
Thank you. It's a very also interesting question. We should maybe research one day about, the so-called Kissinger influence in Russia and for the people dealing with Russia in the strategic community in DC. But that's something very, I think, important. I have no time to elaborate on that, but Kissinger was very popular in Russia and very active through Kissinger Associates during the last 2 decades. I think that it is less sophisticated, and we should remind to people pretending that the White House would like to make the reverse approach by comparison with Nixon and Kissinger. Two things. The very first one was to say that it was possible for Kissinger and Nixon because it was just 3 years after a direct fight between the USSR and China, two nuclear power able to have 20,000 killed people, in 1969. And the second thing is to remind the importance, in my view, but for many analysts, of the declaration between China and Russia of 4th of February 2022, just before the large-scale attacks on Ukraine and the so-called unlimited friendship between China and Russia. The situation now is the fact that we have a military convergence in Ukraine between Russia, North Korea, and Iran, which is politically supported by China. It is a fact that China and Russia, in my opinion, do agree to say that it's time really to push away the so-called Westernization. But there is a debate among them because for Russia, it is by excluding Europeans, by destroying the EU. Whereas, for China, it's not to destroy the EU, but it's much more to try to prepare a new balance with the US. But my point is just to say that I think that the relation now between China and Russia are stronger than what is expected, by the White House.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, you're probably correct. Super final question for Monica. How do the Ukrainians see Italy and the Italian government? Because in this new framework, it's not that clear anymore where Italy stands. I mean, is it clear to Ukrainians where does Italy stand, or do they have some doubts?
They have some doubts, but less than expected. They're very grateful to Italy because they like, well, the person I was talking to, of course, they like a lot the posture, the attitude of Giorgia Meloni with Ukraine, especially at the beginning of her mandate, and they are very grateful to Europe in general. So they don't distinguish much differences between the country, but they are a little bit afraid that Russian propaganda has divided Italy a lot more than other countries. Well, actually, which is quite true, but
Yeah.
they're still very grateful to Italy till this moment.
So we can conclude with this kind of a positive note. So I thank you, both of you, for this fascinating conversation. I think we could continue for hours, but our goal is to keep these webinars short enough that we can we can remain concentrated and focused. So thank you, Monica Perosino. I definitely recommend to all of you who read Italians to read her articles and reporting from the Eastern flank. And thank you, Thomas. It's always a pleasure to interact with you, and I recommend you all to read all the policy briefs and reports by the IFRI, and most importantly, L'accélération de l'histoire, his very, very important and very timely book. Thank you again, and I hope we'll have other opportunities maybe to discuss positive and unexpected developments in this dramatic situation. Thank you all.